The Resident Evil 4 remake seems to be inevitable. A recent report from Video Games Chronicle cites sources saying that Capcom is officially working on a Resident Evil 4 remake. Now, whether or not that's true yet, we figured it's still a good time to talk about some things we don't want in a potential Resident Evil 4 remake. Now, we scoured the internet for opinions, including some of our own here. In 2005, Resident Evil 4 was controversial at the time, believe it or not, and talks of a remake are too. We got a lot to talk about, so let's just dive in with number 7. First and foremost, don't get rid of the cheesy stuff. Resident Evil 4 was a strange hodgepodge of a game. Capcom had reportedly gone back to the drawing board many times, scrapping certain things, reworking some old things they had worked on into stuff they could use in the final game. The biggest thing is, really for us, Capcom, don't lose the charm, the tone, the vibe. That perfect blend of horror with just absolute weird fantasy absurdity. It's part of the reason why Resident Evil 4 did work so well for some people. It was such a dangerous departure from series conventions, but with how unique it ended up being, many people just couldn't resist. That being said, they still can and should make it scarier. The original Resident Evil 4 was kind of the big series diversion away from survival horror. You know, at the very least here, we could get some spookier stuff. I don't know, make the villages creepier, but like I said, we don't want to lose the good stuff in the process. Okay, think of the iconic merchant from Resident Evil 4. The guy you bought weapons and stuff from, the what are you buying guy. Who is he? Why is he? How does he show up? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't matter. But can you imagine a shiny new version of Resident Evil 4 without him? Then, of course, there's Ramon Salazar. As, of course, talks of a remake heated up, everyone on social media was instantly joking that this poor little guy would probably be the first thing on the chopping block. How do you modernize him? Do you make him photorealistic? Ooh. Sometimes I do ask myself like what the point of him really was anyway, but it doesn't matter. He was a special, memorable part of the weird game, and we still talk about him today. They're also gonna need to figure out where to draw the line on some of the zanier in-game moments, like of course running from the boulder, fighting El Gigante, stuff like that. Are they gonna turn the village chief into a Mr. X type thing? Is he gonna even be in it at all? Really, remaking this game is going to be a tightrope act, carefully walking a line between updating some dumb or really flawed things while also keeping the zanier elements that made it special in the first place. I really don't envy the team working on this because that is incredibly tricky. With a remake for Resident Evil 4, it almost seems like you can't please everyone, more than just any other video game, really. Next at number 6, another thing we don't want is cut areas. Capcom, please don't cut some important areas. Seriously, man, the clock tower being cut out of the Resident Evil 3 remake was such a bummer. Like, yeah, maybe they justified it as like trimming the fat of the story. It could have been redundant, but the game ended up feeling so short that it really could have used it. And it was just an area that a lot of people really liked and were excited to revisit in this remake, myself included. Stuff in Resident Evil 4 might be a bit more up to debate. The game, like I said, was so weird and strange that I could see them, unfortunately, pulling a clock tower thing again, like either with cutting the castle or completely reworking the island at the end that annoyed a lot of people, maybe make it into something else. I could see them kind of, them being cut as justification for maybe cleaning up the narrative, modernizing the lore and the flow of the game itself, but again, like I said, this is a tricky balancing act we talked about. Some of the rooms and challenges and overall design of the castle is just so bizarre and weird, but it's part of what makes the game special, and it would feel kind of weird without it at this point. And then, of course, like I said, there's the island where things go full military and the action gets even more over the top and explosive. For a modern recreation of all that, with modern graphics in that engine, all that stuff, that could be more expensive than ever and end up on the chopping block or severely shortened. They could just do a thing where they make the end more lab stuff. I don't know. This is all just big bullshit armchair speculation on our part, of course, but we just don't want a repeat of Resident Evil 3, which we had fun playing, but ultimately felt way too short and brief, and shorter than the original PS1 version. Resident Evil 4 deserves to have a full-scale adventure with all of the places that made it feel special in the first place, as weird as some of them are. Now, next at number 5, don't miss the opportunity to develop characters in some new and exciting ways. Seriously, Capcom, one of the reasons I was so excited about a Resident Evil 4 remake was the fact that so much could be done to make the characters less one-dimensional. 2 and 3 Remake were a really nice start, and 4 could really take the time to do much better for Leon. Back in the day, the original jump from Leon in Resident Evil 2 to Resident Evil 4 was extremely jarring. Yeah, he was a cool federal super agent now. That's it. Get over it. Just accept it. Now he's like a hardcore roundhouse kickflip out of a window badass. But why? They threw some exposition at the start. You know, obviously it's years later after the incident. He's scarred. He's gonna change. But still, yeah, a new Resident Evil 4 could not only make a badass Leon feel more natural, they also could take more time to explain his training, how he grew from dorky cop into Resident Evil 4 Leon. There's gotta be more to it other than just the Raccoon City incident. Then of course there's plenty more room for Ada Wong, and they can make Ashley Graham way less annoying. We don't want them to squander the potential here. Not to mention, please, we don't want them to miss the chance to introduce modern audiences to a new and improved Wesker. You know, they could do him dirty like a certain character who did not show up at the end of the Resident Evil 3 remake like expected, but we hope they don't do that here. There is potential to make up for people's big problem with the intro of Resident Evil 4 and what it did to the lore, how it kind of dismissively ended Umbrella in a way, despite the buildup of some big takedown that a lot of fans were expecting. Of course, we got more explanation of all that in the side games and stuff like the Chronicles games, but maybe we can get something interesting going here? I don't know, we're just spitballing. But down to number 4, I want to cheat here and acknowledge one thing that some people don't want, and that's a remake of the game itself. Many people argue that the game is old, but not really old enough to do anything meaningful to it or make it worthwhile. The internet has raged for the past few days with the huge debate of should they remake Resident Evil 4 at all, with some folks so excited, some folks arguing that it all will probably just feel like a shallow reskin more than anything else since it is still somewhat modern. Some love the game and don't want it tampered with as well. Some people just dislike the game entirely. Resident Evil 4 was a mainstream success, yeah, and it brought on a lot of fans, but opinions on it still deeply, deeply divide the more hardcore underground Resident Evil fan community today, which might surprise some folks, but yeah, some people see this very much as a turning point for the series and a turn in a direction that they ultimately don't like as much as the originals. Either way, a lot of people, including me, would rather them jump on a remake of Resident Evil Code Veronica first and foremost, the underrated Resident Evil game that is so interesting, fun, and creepy, and way more in need of a remake facelift compared to 4. That's just me. Let us know in the comments. You probably want Code Veronica too. We want to hear from you guys. But down to number 3, another thing we don't want a shoehorned multiplayer mode. You know, we'll take extra modes, yeah, sure, but we're good on multiplayer for now. As you know, Resident Evil 3 came with Resident Evil Resistance, the standalone multiplayer mode that was like an asymmetrical, competitive survivors versus evil overseer type thing. It was actually, I will say, more fun than we expected, and a nice addition to the game. It's not the most memorable or lasting mode, but yeah, still, we would have preferred more added to the base game after we realized how short it was. So with a potential Resident Evil 4 remake, we don't want that again. You know, leave the multiplayer to a remake or a completely new Resident Evil Outbreak. That will be great. We want the full attention paid to the game and maybe what we got with Resident Evil 2. You know, a nice little mode like the 4th Survivor, or a simple arena-based Mercenaries mode, or maybe just free add-on DLC stories like we got with Resident Evil 2 Survivors a few months later on. Any opportunity to add some replayability other than a shoehorn multiplayer mode, the Resistance effort was appreciated, but we can't even see how multiplayer would work for a Resident Evil 4 remake. Mercenaries, like I said though, would be pretty sweet. Now down at number 2, we don't want the same controls. This is always a big topic of debate here at gameranx, but also the internet at large. Some folks think Resident Evil 4 is still completely fine, maybe even aged like a fine wine, and the controls are fine the way they are. Oftentimes, the argument is that the slightly clunkier controls add to the stress and anxiety of the survival horror elements, kind of like how the original tank controls worked for Resident Evil 1. It worked for the OG games, works for Resident Evil 4. Other folks though, many folks, think they don't hold up and need a complete overhaul. Now, where do you guys stand? You know, if you think about it, they're most likely obviously going to upgrade the controls. The Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 3 remakes are basically an evolution of the over-the-shoulder control system that Resident Evil 4 kind of pioneered at the time. So, honestly, the gameplay transition here would probably do great. We just hope Capcom has the vision to truly update the controls here. Like we said, probably a definite, but these companies do mess stuff up all the time, and since Resident Evil 4 is a holy grail for many, they may handle it gently with kid gloves and not change enough. Imagine, it's basically the same controls as a Resident Evil 3 remake, but with the ability to roundhouse kick dudes in the face. I think that's pretty okay, and at the very least, a justification for a remake that, to some, is still divisive in the first place. But finally, down to number 1. Okay, the biggest thing we don't want is for Capcom to keep the Ashley escort sections. We don't want the Ashley stuff to be the same. You can absolutely aggressively change a lot of that. Just do it. I know we talked about a lot of things we don't want cut from the game, but we're willing to contradict ourselves here because the President's Daughter stuff is rough. As many of you probably know, babysitting Ashley is probably one of the most annoying parts of the game. Like we mentioned earlier, they can absolutely make her character less annoying, of course, but make the gameplay around her feel less tedious. Please. All we ask is to not neglect these sections. They can add to the survival horror tension, of course they did, but these sections in particular really haven't aged well. They weren't that great then, you dread it every time you'd have to do it, and they're especially frustrating and clunky now, especially with Ashley's voice actor constantly screaming for help. If they have to keep it as a gameplay sequence, maybe with new technology she can have better artificial intelligence, maybe even fend for herself, or strategically hide on her own. I don't know, man, but out of anything in Resident Evil 4, Ashley is something we don't want more of. But of course, these are some things that we don't want in a Resident Evil 4 remake. There's plenty in here that we mentioned that we do want, but of course, the big thing is we want to hear from you guys in the comments. Now is the time to talk about this stuff. Is there a weapon in the game you don't want? Is there an enemy type you want cut? Is there stuff you want added? Do you want more Wesker? Let's talk anything Resident Evil 4, new and old, down in the comments. But if you enjoyed this video, clicking the like button is the best way you can help us out. We'd really appreciate that. And if you're new, consider subscribing, maybe hitting that notification bell, because we put out videos every single day. But as always, thanks for watching. We'll see you guys next time.